I'm happy to be here, and it's a particular pleasure to have Klaus von Beime in the audience, who was on my PhD committee 20 years ago, which I fully understand. Some of you weren't born. For me, that doesn't sound that far away, but still. It was very inspiring, and I will start with an anecdote for those of you who write a PhD. I wrote my PhD about party families, which is something that Klaus von Beime wrote about. And when I was writing at the beginning, as a good PhD student, I was going through the literature and criticizing everyone, because that's what you do when you're a PhD student. You're all full of insecurity and thinking that you know everything better. And so I had written something about Klaus von Beime's book too, and put it in a footnote, arguing that what he had called a typology was actually a classification, which is a fairly nerdy remark to make, but it seemed harmless and pseudo-intellectual at the time. And then my supervisor, the late Peter Mayer, invited Klaus von Beime to be on my committee, but I had forgotten about that footnote. And so when my PhD defense started, which is a pretty big formal affair in the Netherlands, you have to dress up, and there are like 90 people in the audience, everyone you know and don't know. Klaus von Beime, who came from the Thirdes, had the first question and pointed out footnote number 1. And it was only then that I realized that I had put all of my insecurity and cleverness in that one footnote. And of course, knowing all pretty much the stereotypes about German professors, and we Dutch have a lot of stereotypes about Germans in general, I was terrified. And he actually was very kind and just like made fun of me. And so I want to thank him for that. Protecting the people from left and right populism. That's what I'm going to talk about now. I have a roadmap. I'm going to talk about what is populism, why should we worry, who are the most important populists today so that you have an understanding, and why is populism on the rise right now, which is key to know, otherwise you don't know how to deal with it. And so how we should respond. Now, let it be clear that after this event, there will still be populism. And even if you follow my suggestions, there will still be populism. Particularly if you live in Germany, that is not necessarily the biggest problem. One of the things that I want to raise already at the beginning is that it's important to keep things in perspective. And Germany has a right-wing populist party of 12.6% of the vote, which is massive by German standards, which is relatively moderate by European standards. I was last week in Hungary. I can assure you they have way bigger problems than you. Now, populism is the term, and you have to, these days, always obligatory to say, well, there's no consensus definition on populism, and people disagree, and it's all true. There are very few consensus definitions in science in general. And so, while I'm sympathetic for everyone who has a problem with the term populism, doing away with a term because there is no consensus on it is a little bit drastic. That would also mean we have to do away with the term democracy, political party, freedom. I mean, pick whatever term. When you actually look at the literature on populism, which has exploded in the 21st century and is really exploding now, you actually do see a growing consensus, and I would say a consensus around the ideational approach in which populism is seen as a set of ideas. It's a set of ideas that is based on the opposition between the good people and the bad elite. There are very few definitions of populism that don't have that. My personal definition says that populism is a fin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or the general will of the people. And this one works too, so I can walk a bit, because that's boring. So I made it red, the key terms. First of all, in my understanding, it's an ideology, which means it's not just a political style. I actually think that populism is something that guides policies, that yes, it helps political parties and politicians to win power, but once they're in power, they still hold on to populism, and populism will inform what type of policies they implement, and also importantly, how they justify them. At the same time, it's a fin-centered ideology, which means that it doesn't give too many answers to too many issues. For example, populism, as defined here, doesn't necessarily say what type of economic system is the best, or whether you should have a strong executive or not. And as a consequence, as I will discuss soon, populism in its pure form, as only populism, is very rare. Secondly, it is moralist. The distinction between the people and the elite is not on the basis of whether you have money, it's not on the basis of class, it's not on the basis of ethnicity, it's on the basis of morality. The people are pure, not ethnically pure, but morally pure. And the elite are corrupt. And second, it's monist. The people is, the elite is. It's one. All the people share exactly the same interests and values. That's why populists believe that there is something like a general will of the people. The whole people want the same thing. Now, this has, of course, consequences for... That one went away. Sorry, we couldn't load that. It has consequences for the relationship to democracy. Now, democracy is another term that's very hard to define. And I make a distinction between democracy and liberal democracy, which not everyone accepts. Jan Werner Müller, for example, who wrote a very good book about populism, it's called What is Populism, argues that democracy is either liberal democracy or it's not. I believe that there is an important distinction between, and democracy minimalistically can be defined as a combination of popular sovereignty and majority rule, which means that it's a system in which the people elect their leader. In those terms, populism is democratic. Populism wants politics to be an expression of the general will of the people, and so they're perfectly fine with majority rule. However, our democratic system is more than that, and that is what we call either a constitutional or a liberal democracy. And a liberal democracy combines popular sovereignty and majority rule with minority rights, with separation of powers, with rule of law, which are all protections of the individual versus the state, as well as of the minority versus the majority. And that is where populism has a problem. Because populism believes that there is only one people. And so it believes that any minority is the elite. And because the elite is corrupt, they're not a legitimate opponent. Like when the other part is corrupt, it doesn't deserve minority rights. It doesn't deserve protection through the law. And it doesn't deserve a voice. Now, as said, very few parties or politicians are purely populist. The one that comes closest probably is the Five Star Movement in Italy. which does have some other positions, but it doesn't clearly have an other underlying ideology. On average, right-wing populists combine populism with one of two so-called host ideologies, either neoliberalism, and that would be neoliberal populist parties like Forza Italia of Silvio Berlusconi, or with nativism, kind of a xenophobic form of nationalism, which is what I call the populist radical right, which are parties like the AFD or the Lega, Front National, FPÖ. There are many of them. So those are the host ideologies. And on the left, the host ideology is some form of socialism. And on left populism, you can think in Europe about Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, or if you want to go to Latin America, think about Chavismo in Venezuela, or Rafael Correa in Ecuador. Now, in most cases, the host ideology is actually more important than populism. And so, when you think about Front National, you think first and foremost about nativism. However, in the early 20th century, nativism was mostly presented through an elitist view. Think about fascism. Fascism didn't think that the people were pure. They believed that the leader was pure. That's why they had the Führerprinzip. They didn't believe in democracy because they believed that if everyone would vote, you would get a mediocracy. The mediocre would rule. And why would you have people vote if you had Hitler? Because Hitler knew everything better. To a certain extent, Lenin was that for Marxism. And so, while contemporary populist parties are actually first and foremost some form of socialist or nativist, the populist aspect is important and shouldn't be ignored, but I think also shouldn't be overplayed. Simply stated, today, populism is more on the left in the south and on the right in the north, and that applies both to Europe and to the Americas. Think about Donald Trump, right populism in the north versus Correa, Morales, left populism in the south. So who are the most important populists? This is a list. There's a lot on this slide, so we'll talk you through it. First of all, there are 20 countries. I only focus on the EU, but you all know very well there are 28 EU countries until the UK finally exits. So it's important. Not all of them are here. Then we have the most important political party, populist political party in that country. That means the populist party that gets the most votes. There are various countries that have more than one populist party. I've done the colors not just to keep it interesting. There's an idea behind it. The idea is that they stand for different forms of populism. Black is what I call the populist radical right. They combine nativism with populism. Red is left populism, combining socialism, some form of, with populism. Blue is neoliberal populism. And then green is kind of esoteric. We don't really know what it is. The Finns party recently split, and they seem to become black now. They've become more populist radical right. But Five-Star Movement will have to see in government where they go. So what you see is there's quite diversity, but there's also a lot of diversity in their electoral support. In the third column, you see the score that they had in the last European election. And then in the fourth column, you see the score that they had in the last national election. And overall, the difference is very small. It's about 18% on average in the European election and about 19% on average in the national election. However, remember, this is 20 out of 28, and these are the biggest ones, which means that actually the average vote of populist parties in the EU, the biggest populist party in the EU, is probably closer to 15, 14%. Now, the ranking means that within the national party system, Fidesz is the first, is the biggest party, whereas Vlaams Belang is the 10th biggest party. Right? So you see that on average, the biggest populist party is the third biggest party in the party system, which is important because given how much we talk about populism, and no one talks about it as much as I do, you get the impression that populism is the most important thing. It is the third most important thing. We just talk about it at least 3 times as much as the first and second most important thing, which roughly is the center-right and the center-left. Finally, the second from last column is the percentage, the total percentage of populist support. As said, in many countries there are at least 2 populist parties. In Germany, although I will get at least one person in the Q&A who's going to criticize this, you have a left-wing populist party called Die Linke, and you have a right-wing populist party called AfD. In some countries, the situation is a little bit more severe, and you have a right-wing, a radical right populist party in government, Fidesz, and you have a radical right populist party as the most important opposition party, Jobbik. If you look at that, again, you see massive changes, differences, but you also see that the average of the total populist vote in Europe is 25%, which again, if you make that of the 28, then you're generous at putting it at 20%. I just want to really hammer that down, because obviously this goes against my own self-interest, because I have books to sell about populism and tours to do, but we're talking about something that is a minority of the political space. 20% means that 80% is not populist. Now, anyone who has an understanding, basic understanding of math, knows that 80% is a very healthy majority. However, what you also see is that there is a difference between countries. The 4 in red, 2 of them have a majority of populist voters. Italy and Hungary are countries where more than 2/3 of the people voted for a populist party. In Poland and Greece, more than half of the population voted for either a populist or an extremist party, namely a party that is against democracy per se. And so in 4 of the EU countries, liberal democratic parties are a minority. And that is, of course, relevant. And that is important to keep in mind, that we talk about the rise of populism as if it's one rise, as if it is the same in every country. But it isn't. In Portugal, you have virtually nothing. In Germany, you have a relatively modest populist party. In Hungary, they're both the government and the most important opposition party. And so that's an incredible range of situations. And obviously, what you can and should do in Germany is different than what you can and should do in Hungary. I was in Budapest recently, and as I was there last summer, and it's a very depressing country to get the question of what should we do. Because the answer is pretty much, you can do whatever you want, but it's not going to work. Whereas if I get the question here, I sometimes get annoyed because I just see a party of 12.6%, and I think, if that would be your only problem, you can do whatever you want, and you have a very healthy majority. Now, the question that we need to address, of course, is why is populism successful? And to a certain extent, why is populism successful now? Many social science theories explain why potentially something could become successful. But when you look at the theory, it often means that, well, it could have been already successful 20 years ago, or it could have waited 20 more. This theory, and it's not even theories, these ideas are not that different, but you do see that at least in the 1980s, things have been shifting. One of the reasons why populism is successful now is because important issues are not adequately addressed by the elites. What this means is that there is a significant portion of the population that believes that important issues are not addressed by the elite. This was definitely true in the 1980s and the 1990s. Immigration was an issue that already in the 1980s was considered important by part of the population, most notably white working class. It became more important also to the lower middle classes in the 1990s, and it became only addressed in many countries in the late 1990s. European integration was a non-issue pretty much up until 1992, the Maastricht Treaty. Since the Maastricht Treaty, you see that Euroscepticism is going up, and yet most countries have no fundamental debate about the European Union, not even during European elections. And so there's an argument to be made, but it doesn't really matter that much whether it is true or not. What matters is whether people feel that issues are not addressed. And I give you an example from my own country, the so-called liberal Mecca of the Netherlands, which now vies together with Denmark for being pretty much the most Islamophobic country in Europe. Wait, in Western Europe. Obviously, we can't beat the Central and East Europeans on this. And we've had Pim Fortuyn, a politician who came up in 2002 and was killed in 2002 too. And since that 2002 election, every single election in the Netherlands has been about immigration and Islam. Every single newspaper in the Netherlands has at least one Islamophobic columnist. And yet, my timeline on Twitter is full of people, Dutch people, who tell me that you can't say anything negative about Islam in the Netherlands. Yet I can't see anyone saying anything positive about Islam in the Netherlands. That doesn't matter. People act on the basis of how they think the world works, not how the world really works. And so this is one of the big problems with some of these causes. Like, you can say, well, but that's not how it works. If they think that important issues are kept off the agenda, then they will behave accordingly. Elites are perceived as being all the same. It doesn't matter whether you vote for the left or the right, you get the same policy. Again, this is not completely without any cause. In many countries, you have, for example, grand coalitions, or you have center-left governments being replaced by center-right governments who, on many issues, implement fairly similar type of policies. One of the reasons why they do that in rhetoric is globalization, but more concretely is the European Union. We're all in the European Union, and the smaller the country is, the less you can weigh on it. And so the ultimate lesson that we learn is that this behavior of that it doesn't matter who is in government, whether it's the left or the right, Greece tells us that it barely even actually matters whether it's a populist or not. Because the current populist government is implementing roughly the same policy as the previous mainstream policy. And the reason is the same. Within the contemporary constructions of European politics, there are phenomenal constraints on particularly smaller countries. And so this idea that the differences between the parties isn't that big is not that bizarre. It also, of course, depends on what you focus on. If your focus is, if you're Eurosceptic, then yes, what is the difference between CDU and SPD? If you're, by and large, don't want any immigrants to get in, then again, what is the difference between the center-right and the center-left? On a more positive note, people have more efficacy, which means political self-confidence. And this is a process that was described by the American political scientist Ronald Inglehart as cognitive mobilization. Cognitive mobilization meant that from the 60s on, more people got higher educated, but not just that they got more education, they also got more self-confidence. Today, most people feel that they can judge political issues. In the 1960s, 1950s, this wasn't the case. Most people felt that politics was above their head, and they followed whatever the priest said or whatever the trade unionist said. Right? And so we actually have become now much more closer to that democratic ideal that political theorists write about independent voters that critically assess politicians. Unfortunately, they do it a little bit too critically, but in itself, I think this is a positive thing. Populist actors have become more attractive in the sense that they're just better at what they do. When you look at a populist leader like Geert Wilders, for example, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders is a very good politician, has been elected Politician of the Year 3 times by a popular poll, because he's well prepared, he knows his issues, and he knows the weaknesses of the people he debates with. He's also a master of Twitter, way better than Trump. Like Trump, by and large, spams you. For a long time, Geert Wilders dominated Dutch politics on the basis of 1 or 2 tweets a day. Very well-crafted tweets that were so provocative that journalists who live on Twitter would run with it, write a story about it, and then go to mainstream politicians and say, Geert Wilders tweeted this, what do you think? And they would have a debate about it, in which, incidentally, Geert Wilders never participated. He just moved it, let the rest talk about what he wanted to talk about and under which frame, and moved on till the next one. Right? Beppe Grillo, the godfather of the Five-Star Movement, had the most popular political blog in Italy. FPÖ, particularly Strache, had a very strong presence on Facebook. And so they used the social media very well. But before we get carried away and think that social media changes everything, it's important to remember that not just social media changed, the traditional media changed a lot. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, virtually all media was either controlled by the state or controlled by trade unions, churches, or political parties. That meant that there was a phenomenal gatekeeper function. Editors could keep certain things in, other things out. In the 1980s, this started to already be undermined, particularly by private TV. Think about RTL here, which started its own news, which then competed with the official news, which in Germany hasn't adjusted that much, but for example in the Netherlands, there's virtually no space anymore between public and private TV news. and it looks a lot more than the private TV news than the public one. Almost all media today are independent and motivated by economics, by money, which means that they need to sell. They need to, in American they say, you need to chase eyeballs. Because you have to go to your advertiser, who actually pays, because all of you don't subscribe. You just parasite of free media. Right? And so what they need to do is they need to sell advertisement. But to sell advertisement, you have to say, people read me. And how do you get people to read you? By clickbait titles, by scandals. And who does scandal really well? Populists. Right? So the whole media structure is much more favorable today for populists. Even if populists were as attractive as they were today, in the 1960s, 70s, they would have had a very hard time, because they would just have been shut out from the media, who didn't depend at that point in time as much on that financial incentive. On top of that, even now when some of the media still wants to keep populists out, which in Germany, for example, is still much stronger than many other countries, if something becomes really big on social media, where there are no gatekeepers, it becomes very hard for traditional media to ignore it. So we have all of these factors, and it's very important, all of these factors are structural. This is not a crisis. These are structural changes. The reason why various issues are considered to be not addressed is because politics has become three-dimensional, at the very least. Why do politicians look more and more the same? Because the structure in which they operate is more narrow. Like, education has fundamentally changed, and I always see that with regard actually to Germany. If I compare young German scholars of when I was a young Dutch scholar compared to now, it's very different. And one of the reasons is the way German education system is much less hierarchical today than it used to be. By Dutch standards, it's probably still very hierarchical, but in a longer perspective, you're much more taught across Europe to think for yourself. And so this is important, because one of the theories that we have is, well, populism became popular because of the Great Recession, or because of the so-called refugee crisis, which then would mean that as soon as we're out of that crisis, we just go back to the old world, for the sake of argument, assuming that that was a good world. Right? We won't. Even after the crisis, almost all of these things remain. Now, why would we care? Aren't those populists kind of cool? A little bit. One of the things that populists do, particularly in opposition, is that they politicize or repoliticize issues. Without the populist radical right, we would not have talked about immigration in the 1990s. It probably would eventually have come, but much later. We would not have talked even about austerity without the left-wing populists. Right? So they politicize issues or repoliticize issues, and they say, it doesn't matter whether you think this is the only way. We believe that if the people want something else, they should be able to get that. However, populism also leads to polarization of the political debate. And this is because the distinction is moral. If in the old Marxist tradition, probably not that strong here in Heidelberg, but you had classes, capital and labor. And they were fundamentally opposed, but they were about different interests. Capitalism, for the sake of argument, wanted to pay you only €1 per hour more, and you wanted €3 per hour more. And you could, by and large, come together at 1.5, because let's face it, labor always loses more than it wins. That's fine. But if you're pure and the other is corrupt, and you compromise, the pure gets corrupted. And that's unacceptable. The corrupt is not a legitimate opponent with whom you can negotiate. The corrupt deserves no sympathy. That leads to polarization, but unfortunately, many liberal Democrats respond to populism with anti-populism, which is also a moral distinction. But now it is the populists who are the corrupt ones, and us liberal Democrats who are the pure ones. Think about the classic mistake of Hillary Clinton during the elections, where she called Trump supporters deplorables. Like, deplorables are not people with a legitimate different opinion or interest. Deplorables you don't need to listen to. They don't deserve your rights. They don't deserve your protection. And so polarization comes from both sides. We see also an increase of the opportunistic use of plebiscitarian instruments. Think particularly about referendums. Now that is in itself not problematic, although referendums have a tendency to strengthen polarization. Think about Brexit. One of the things that you see though with populists is that populists particularly like referendums when they're in opposition. Also when they get into power, because when they come to power there's still some power structures of the previous regime. But referendums for a populist regime are problematic. Because if populists lose a referendum while in power, their prime claim of being the voice of the people is undermined. So populists cannot lose referendums too much. In opposition it's fine, because then it was the corrupt elite that manipulated public opinion, blah, 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 blah. You can. But when you are in power of all of that and you lose, it by and large means that you're not the voice of the people. So what you often see is that populists, when they get into power, they only lose one referendum. After that, there is no other referendum anymore. We see a weakening of non-majoritarian institutions, those that should protect the individual from the state, particularly courts and media. Hungary is a very painful example. Hungary has virtually no independent media left, outside of a few websites and one German-owned TV station, RTL Klub. But populists today don't work in the way that the old fascists works. They don't ban stuff, because that's a red flag. So what do you do if you have a newspaper that all the time writes about your corruption scandals? That's not good. So you just ask your friend to buy that newspaper, as Viktor Orban did with his high school friend, who miraculously became the 5th richest Hungarian within a couple of years. And so his friend buys Népszabadság, which was the most important opposition newspaper, and then decided that there was actually no market for that newspaper, so he folded it. No more independent newspaper. And yet, totally legal. After all, he bought it, he can do whatever he wants with it. The courts, similar kind of thing. While the Poles go a little bit rough at it, Viktor Orban went about it much smarter. First, he made a mandatory maximum age. And so that meant that about 1/3 of the Supreme Court judges had to retire. Then he increased the number of judges that are on the Supreme Court, which meant that after both of these measures, the majority of Supreme Court judges were his own cronies. So populism is not like fascism. It doesn't demolish the democratic state and create an alternative. It transforms a liberal democratic regime into an illiberal democratic regime. And this is, again, what we see already for a while in Hungary. We're seeing Poland go to it. The question is that the end point, or is that just an in-between phase? Can an illiberal democratic system be stable? Or will it inevitably have to go either back to a liberal democracy or become fully authoritarian, in which the opposition might still contest elections but cannot win them, like Russia? Now, if you look at Venezuela, under Chavez, it was a liberal democracy. He transformed it into an illiberal democracy, and it has now become an authoritarian regime. If you look at Turkey, they're probably one election away from becoming an autocratic regime. And so perhaps populism will not stop at an illiberal democracy, but is destined to become autocratic. Now, what should we not do? Which is actually also very important, because these are the things that we mostly do. We should neither ignore nor repress populists, the left or the right. The ignoring we have done in the 80s, and clearly that didn't work. The repressing we've also done in the 80s and the 90s, and some countries still do. It also doesn't work. More importantly, it becomes more and more difficult to repress the radical right when they look more and more like the mainstream right. And so at a certain point in time, that type of repression either starts to fail because the mainstream right is starting to worry that they are next, or it's still there, and many people will see the hypocrisy of it and think like, wait a minute, why does that person of the AfD, like, is he not allowed to say this, whereas this person of the CSU is allowed to say this? We have this debate in the Netherlands all the time about what Geert Wilders says and then what some politicians from the center-right and the center-left say. And the argument is, well, you should see it in the context. But that's a dodgy argument, legally as well as politically. We have to understand that populism is a symptom of a broader problem. Populism is not the problem itself. Hungary and countries where populism is in power, different matter. Let's take the German case. Let's ban the AfD. Does that strengthen liberal democracy? Not one bit. AfD doesn't have any power at the moment. All the power that it gets from the majority parties. And the people who voted for the AfD are not becoming CDU or SPD supporters because you banned the AfD. They're probably even more dissatisfied with the political system. Because that's what populism is. People don't vote for populism within a liberal democratic system because they're happy. Populism is always protest. And so you have to understand, why are people upset? In many cases, populists ask the right questions, but provide the wrong answers. It was a good question to ask, how is this multicultural society working? We still don't know how. It was a good question to ask, how is this austerity going to help the south of Europe? We still don't have a right answer. But their answer often is based on the assumption that the people are one, and that the corrupt are elite, which leads to conspiracy theories, which leads to ideas that the EU is really just some kind of new Nazi Germany. And that doesn't help us anything. But just because they don't give the right answers doesn't mean that those questions cannot be important. As I said, anti-populism is counterproductive. It leads to a more moralist debate, which makes consensus only more difficult. The US at the moment is at a very, very bad place. Polarization is through the roof. And a recent study showed, for example, that 47% of Democrats would not approve if their sibling would come home dating a Republican. Like, that's higher than scores on race. That's not easy to come to some kind of liberal democratic regime if you consider the other half of your country as almost subhuman. And undemocratic liberalism is not a solution, but actually one of the main causes of populism. Undemocratic liberalism means that certain policies that are informed by liberalism, be that cultural liberalism, such as gay rights or gender equality, or the abolishment of death penalty, or neoliberalism, such as central banks, privatization of virtually everything. Right? All of these kind of things have mostly been introduced outside of the public debate. They're normally procedurally democratic because it was democratically elected politicians who did it. And so whenever the European Central Bank does something, it ultimately got its power through democratically elected people. But those things didn't follow from open debates. They weren't election campaign points. And so a lot of the neoliberalism, as well as a lot of the liberalism, was never really put in front of the people, was never really debated. And what you see today as a response to Trump and Brexit in particular is this kind of idea that, well, maybe the world is too complex for the people. So maybe we should keep the really difficult things away from elections. That's exactly how you get populism. Because populists say, we can judge this. And if the majority doesn't want it, we shouldn't have it. So what should we do? We should strengthen liberal democracy. Now that sounds trivial, but that's actually the real struggle. The real struggle is not to fight populism. As said, if you fight populism, you might no longer have populism, but you still have a not very well functioning liberal democracy. Yet, if you strengthen liberal democracy, by definition, populism will be weaker, because populism is the opposite. Now, how do you do that? You do that by re-ideologizing politics. One of the big problems today is that we're living in an ideological vacuum. Social democracy killed itself in the 1990s through Tony Blair and Gerhard Schröder, and became not just neoliberal, but pragmatic. It by and large denounced ideologies and argued that things should be done pragmatically. The center-right has moved into that direction pretty much over the last decade or so. Angela Merkel was one of the first, but David Cameron is another example, or my shining example from the Netherlands, Prime Minister Mark Rutte, who is very proud of the fact that he doesn't have any vision. He sees that as a strength, because he's a problem solver. The problem, when you're a problem solver, is that you don't define what the problem is. That does someone who actually does have an ideology. Let's go back to 2015. There are hundreds and thousands of asylum seekers coming to Europe. At that point in time, you can look at it in all kinds of different ways. A social democrat, a real one, would think international solidarity. These are the weak, we should support them. A real libertarian would think, these are reasonably highly educated Syrians. They can work for a little money. It's good for business. A real Christian Democrat would pretty much respond as Merkel responded, with Caritas. But except of Merkel, almost no one responded. There was one voice, the radical right. And they shouted, a lot of Muslims coming. That's a danger to our national culture. And so Mark Rutte says, oh, there's a lot of people coming. Someone said that they are a danger to our national culture. I'm going to solve that. Right? That's the problem of pragmatism. The problem of pragmatism is you solve problems that have been defined by others. To grab back the agenda setting, you have to re-ideologize politics. You have to define what is a problem. And then those problem solvers can solve them in your way. Politicians should follow and lead. Yes, politics in Western Europe has been very paternalistic for a very long time. It was an elite that knew better how the people should lead. I mean, think about European integration and the whole way that it was set up. It was a very small elite that believed, from a genuine, not conspiracy theory, from particularly the Second World War, that this was the way forward. Until the 1970s, that was fine, because most people also believed that they weren't ready to make those decisions. But today, people want to make that decisions. But what we have done is we have become followers of the people. And the Netherlands is a perfect place, at least for lectures. We had a government that was elected, and the first thing they did was go into the country for 100 days to hear what they should do. So imagine that. You're a political party, you have campaigned on something, you have one power, and now you're actually going to ask, what should I do with that? So the idea is that the people know what they want, is an assumption, that there's also one idea there that you can just tap into, and that you can then do that. Politics should be about leading. It should be that social democrats say, I think that this is the best way that society is structured. If you're with me, come. If you have anything to say about that, how to make that better, let's listen. Christian Democrats should do that. Liberals should do that. Greens should do that. Radical right should do that. Right? And then related to that, people and politicians should share responsibility. In this populist zeitgeist that we're in today, we have, in part through a neoliberal kind of ideology in which the client is king, we've gotten into a discourse where the voter is always right. Gotten into this discourse that whatever is wrong is because of politicians. When we had the very long process of government coalition formation, which really by Dutch standards wasn't that long, but for Germans was very long, right? There was a lot of complaint. Why don't you just make a government? Right? Well, they don't make a government because people voted for all kinds of different parties, right? That's a consequence. And so, but politicians don't say that. And so if politicians all the time claim that pretty much the people never make a mistake, then obviously the only people that can be responsible for the mistakes are they. Right? So politics has to become more mature. Politicians should trust the people, and people should trust politicians. And that might sound naive, but I actually honestly believe that the vast, vast majority of people do not look for some utopia. They know very well also that populists will not deliver everything they promise. But the difference between the populist and the mainstream politician today is that they at least promise something, whereas most of the mainstream parties don't anymore. Thank you very much.